Four men struggle to hold down their friend as he thrashes violently. His eyes roll back, and a voice unlike his own emerges. This isn't a scene from a horror movie, it's straight from the Gospels. One of many encounters Jesus had with what the Bible calls demonic influence. Today, we're exploring what Jesus actually taught about recognizing spiritual opposition and why his insights still matter, whether you're a believer or simply curious about this fascinating topic. Before we dive in, let's be clear. This isn't about promoting fear or seeing demons behind every corner. Instead, we're going to examine Jesus' teachings with both respect for the biblical text and awareness of modern perspectives. After all, Jesus himself emphasized discernment over fear. First, let's understand the historical context. In first-century Palestine, people attributed many afflictions to demonic influence. But interestingly, Jesus didn't validate every claim of demonic activity. He approached each situation with remarkable discernment, often treating illnesses as illnesses and only addressing spiritual influences when he recognized specific signs. So what were the signs Jesus identified? Let's look at his documented encounters. In the Gospel of Mark, we see several key indicators that Jesus specifically addressed. First was the presence of supernatural knowledge. Demons recognizing Jesus' true identity when even his disciples didn't fully understand who he was. "I know who you are, the Holy One of God," they would cry out. Another sign Jesus noted was supernatural strength, as in the case of the Gerasene demoniac who could break chains and whom no one could restrain. But here's something crucial. Jesus never jumped to supernatural conclusions without careful observation. Perhaps most interesting is Jesus' emphasis on the impact on human dignity. In many cases, he encountered people who had been isolated from their communities, living in tombs or on the outskirts of society. The spiritual oppression had social and relational consequences. But here's where things get really fascinating. Jesus consistently distinguished between mental illness, physical ailments, and genuine spiritual opposition. In Matthew's Gospel, we see him separately listing and treating those having seizures and the paralyzed and those who were demon-possessed. He didn't lump all suffering into one category. Jesus also identified disruption of worship and resistance to spiritual truth as potential indicators. In Luke's Gospel, we see an account of a woman who had been bent over for 18 years. Jesus identified this as spiritual bondage specifically because it manifested in the synagogue and prevented proper worship. What's particularly noteworthy is Jesus' compassionate approach. Unlike many religious leaders of his time, he never blamed the afflicted person or suggested they had done something to deserve their condition. Instead, he approached each situation with compassion and authority. Let's look at the common patterns Jesus identified in these encounters. Throughout the Gospels, we see him noting several consistent signs. Supernatural knowledge that went far beyond normal human capacity, along with extreme physical manifestations that defied natural explanation. He also pointed to a strong aversion to sacred things or worship, something that set these cases apart from ordinary illnesses. Another crucial pattern was the disruption of normal human relationships, often leading to isolation or erratic social behavior. Finally, Jesus often encountered people suffering from a profound loss of personal identity or dignity, where the individual's true self seemed to be suppressed or altered. These patterns, when appearing together, formed a distinctive profile that Jesus approached differently from other ailments he encountered. However, Jesus also demonstrated what not to attribute to demonic influence. He healed many people with various afflictions without any mention of spiritual causation. This balanced approach is crucial for our understanding today. Speaking of today, how do we apply Jesus' insights in our modern context? First, it's important to note that many conditions once attributed to demons are now understood as medical or psychological issues. Jesus' example actually supports this distinction. He never opposed medical treatment or practical solutions. Modern theological scholars point out that Jesus' approach was notably different from other religious figures of his time. He didn't perform elaborate rituals or use magical formulas. His responses were direct, authoritative, and focused on restoration rather than spectacle. This brings us to an essential point about discernment. Jesus emphasized wisdom in distinguishing between different types of problems. He demonstrated that not every problem is spiritual, but spiritual problems do exist and require spiritual solutions. In the mental health field today, professionals recognize what they call religious or spiritual problems as a distinct diagnostic category. This doesn't validate every claim of spiritual influence, but it acknowledges that some experiences don't fit neatly into purely psychological or medical categories. What about cultural perspectives? Different societies throughout history have interpreted these signs differently. Some anthropologists note that what one culture calls demonic influence, another might identify as shamanic gifts or psychological phenomena. Jesus' approach seems to transcend cultural boundaries by focusing on the impact on human wholeness and dignity. Here's something particularly relevant for today. Jesus never taught his followers to be obsessed with demonic influence. Instead, he emphasized authority over fear, wisdom over superstition, and restoration over condemnation. Contemporary Christian leaders often point to the broader patterns Jesus identified. Anything that persistently destroys human dignity, severs relationships, or creates aversion to genuine spirituality might have a spiritual component. However, they also emphasize Jesus' balanced approach, looking for natural explanations first and avoiding the tendency to spiritualize every problem. This brings us to practical application. Jesus' insights suggest a balanced approach to these situations. We see in his example that we should start with natural explanations for problems, not immediately jumping to spiritual conclusions. When faced with troubling situations, he shows us the wisdom of seeking appropriate medical or psychological help when needed. His method teaches us to look for consistent patterns rather than focusing on isolated incidents that might have simpler explanations. Throughout his ministry, Jesus emphasized the importance of focusing on restoration rather than creating sensationalism around these encounters. Above all, his approach teaches us to maintain compassion rather than rushing to judgment, a principle that remains deeply relevant today. Modern pastoral counselors often combine Jesus' spiritual insights with contemporary understanding. They recognize that problems can have multiple layers: physical, emotional, and sometimes spiritual. This integrated approach honors both Jesus' teachings and modern knowledge. It's worth noting that Jesus' primary message wasn't about identifying demons, but about restoration and wholeness. Even in cases of clear spiritual opposition, his focus was on healing and restoring dignity to the afflicted person. So what can we learn from Jesus' insights about recognizing spiritual influence? First, that discernment is crucial. Not every problem has a spiritual cause. Second, that compassion should guide our response. And third, that the goal is always restoration and wholeness, not fear or sensationalism. Whether you approach this topic from a position of faith or scholarly interest, Jesus' balanced, compassionate, and discerning approach offers valuable wisdom. He teaches us to neither ignore spiritual realities nor obsess over them, but to approach each situation with wisdom, compassion, and hope for restoration. Remember, Jesus' ultimate message wasn't about the power of darkness, but about the greater power of light and love to restore and heal. That's a message that transcends religious boundaries and speaks to our shared human experience. What are your thoughts on this delicate topic? How do you balance spiritual awareness with practical wisdom? Share your perspectives in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thoughtful explorations of faith and life.